He was the most feared mafia boss in the city, ruthless, cold, untouchable. One reckless night changed everything. She was just a maid, but that night would bind their fates forever. Years later she returned, not alone, but with 3 children, all looking just like him. And now, the man who destroyed everything must face the consequences of the life he abandoned. The night was painted in sorrow and rain. The sky wept as if it knew a storm far greater was about to rise inside that mansion of stone and secrets. Each drop of rain kissed the window panes, echoing through long, empty halls that once held laughter, but now breathed silence. The mansion belonged to the man everyone feared, the name whispered in alleys, the shadow people avoided. Kellen. Ruthless, calculated, a man who ruled with blood and silence. Yet tonight, he wasn't the man the city knew. Tonight, he was something darker, something broken. He entered his home like a ghost of his own power. His footsteps were unsteady, the air thick with whiskey and anger. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within him. His world had been built on control, but tonight, control was slipping through his fingers like sand. His men had failed a mission. A betrayal had cost him millions. He was furious, wounded in pride, desperate for silence. Yet the silence of that mansion felt too heavy, too alive. It was the kind of silence that reminded him of everything he had lost, everything he never dared to want. And in that silence, she appeared, Binta, the maid who moved like a whisper. Her beauty wasn't loud, it was quiet, like the calm before dawn. She was arranging flowers in a crystal vase, her slender fingers trembling slightly each time thunder growled outside. She didn't know he had returned. She didn't know the devil himself was watching her, his gaze sharp, his heart beating faster for reasons he would never admit. Kaylin's eyes traced her movements, the way her hair curled slightly at her neck, the softness of her lips when she bit them in focus. For a moment, he forgot who he was. He forgot the empire of violence built under his command. All he saw was peace, a peace he didn't deserve. He took a step forward, and the sound of his shoe against marble made her freeze. The vase nearly slipped from her hands. She turned, and the scent of rain and whiskey filled the air between them. Her eyes met his, and the world stopped breathing. Something electric passed in that gaze. Fear. Curiosity. Something dangerously close to longing. Kellen had seen hundreds of faces, faces that begged, lied, and worshipped, but none ever made him pause like this one trembling maid did. Her silence challenged him. Her innocence mocked the darkness he carried. He hated how she looked at him, not with fear, but with something that felt like pity. He wanted to break that look. He wanted to remind her who he was. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. The air grew thick, their hearts out of rhythm. She could smell the sharpness of whiskey, the weight of his sin. Every instinct in her screamed to move away, but something deeper, a strange, foolish ache, held her there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was the cruel beginning of something neither could escape. Kellen reached out, brushing a strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was rough, cold, but it burned. Her breath caught, her knees weakened. He wasn't supposed to touch her like that. She wasn't supposed to feel like this, but when his hand lingered, the storm outside roared louder, as if the heavens themselves tried to warn them. Too late. In that moment, 2 worlds collided, the ruthless and the pure, the master and the maid, the sinner and the saint. Their eyes locked again, and everything else faded, the storm, the fear, the rules, the distance. There was only the sound of thunder, the flicker of candlelight, and the wild rhythm of hearts losing control. She didn't know if he was angry or lonely. She didn't know if he saw her or just needed someone to feel alive again. But when his fingers trailed down her arm, fire bloomed where his touch fell. The room spun with heat and confusion. Binta's thoughts screamed stop, yet her heart whispered stay. It wasn't supposed to happen. But it did. The night turned from fury to fire. His lips crashed onto hers with a hunger that felt like punishment and prayer all at once. The scent of rain mixed with the taste of sin. Her hands trembled, caught between resistance and surrender. His world was dangerous, his heart locked behind steel. But tonight, both melted. Every kiss carried pain, every breath was stolen, and every heartbeat echoed a warning neither would heed. Outside, lightning split the sky, but inside, the storm was theirs. The mansion walls bore witness to something forbidden, fragile, and fated. The Mafia boss who ruled empires was losing control over one fragile heart, and she, the woman who had always feared him, was falling for the danger she should have run from. When the night faded into dawn, the fire died. The room reeked of whiskey, regret, and something wordless. The sunlight crept through the curtains like a cruel truth. She lay there, breath shallow, heart aching. He stood by the window, his back to her, buttoning his shirt in silence. His face was unreadable again, his mask back in place. Without turning, his voice sliced through the quiet. Forget it ever happened. She froze. The same lips that had whispered heat hours ago now spilled ice. Her eyes burned as tears welled up. She wanted to ask why, but her voice betrayed her. He didn't look back. He just walked away, cold, distant, untouched, as if she were nothing more than a mistake he couldn't afford to remember. The sound of the door closing was louder than any gunshot. That was the moment her heart shattered into dust. She sat there, staring at the empty doorway, feeling the echo of his presence fading. The sheets smelled of him, of rain and ruin. She pulled them close, as if they could fill the emptiness he left behind. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside her, a storm began that would never truly end. Hours passed, but she couldn't move. She stared at the flowers she'd arranged the night before, now wilted, lifeless. It felt like a cruel reflection of her own heart. Every corner of that mansion whispered his name, and every breath she took hurt like confession. She was just the maid. He was the Mafia boss. It was never meant to be love. And yet something inside her knew it was. As she finally gathered the courage to leave the room, her legs trembled. The corridors stretched endlessly, lined with portraits of men like him, powerful, heartless, untouchable. She wondered if any of them ever felt what she was feeling now. Regret? Hope? Or maybe just the cruel reminder that love never belonged in places built by blood. She reached the main door and stopped. The world outside was washed clean by rain, glistening under pale sunlight. She looked back one last time, her eyes tracing the mansion that held her first sin and her deepest secret. She wanted to forget him. She wanted to erase every touch, every shiver, every unspoken promise. But how do you forget the night that changes everything? A single tear rolled down her cheek as she stepped into the light. The wind whispered against her skin, carrying the faint echo of his voice. Cold, distant, final. Yet somewhere deep inside her, beneath the heartbreak and the silence, a whisper stirred. A whisper she didn't understand, a feeling she couldn't bury. Because that night wasn't just an ending, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous, something she couldn't run from, something she would carry within her long after the pain faded. The mansion stood behind her, still and silent, but inside its walls, a piece of her remained. She didn't know it then, but destiny had already begun its cruel game. And the man who had just turned his back on her would soon realize no sin stays buried forever. As the sun broke through the clouds, the wind carried a promise neither could hear yet. A promise written in fire, born from one reckless night that neither could undo. And though the world had moved on, fate had already tied their souls in invisible chains. She walked away with trembling steps, unaware that inside her, a new heartbeat had begun. 3 tiny heartbeats that would one day return to that mansion and rewrite their story. The rain stopped, the silence deepened, and the night that changed everything had only just begun. She didn't know that one reckless night would bind their fates forever, and that her footsteps leaving the mansion were only the first echoes of destiny's return. The morning after she left that mansion, the sky was painted with the pale sorrow of dawn. The air was damp, still carrying the faint echo of last night's rain. Binta walked down the long, empty road, her shoes soaked, her heart heavier than the clouds above. The world looked different now, colder, crueler, as if it knew what she had lost. Her body ached, but the ache inside her chest was far worse. She didn't look back at the mansion. She couldn't. Behind those stone walls, she had lost more. Than her heart, she had lost the illusion that love could soften a monster. Days turned into weeks. She found a small place to live, a tiny room above a tailor's shop in the outskirts of the city. The rent was cheap, the air smelled of dust and old fabric, and the nights were filled with the distant hum of sirens and city sorrow. She worked quietly, cleaning and sewing during the day, trying to bury her memories beneath layers of exhaustion. But no matter how hard she tried, the ghost of that night followed her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the way his hands trembled before they turned cold, the way his lips once whispered her name like it meant something. And every morning, she reminded herself, it didn't. It was late one evening when she noticed the first sign. A sudden wave of dizziness made her drop the bucket she was carrying. Water spilled across the wooden floor, reflecting her pale face in its ripples. She pressed a trembling hand against her stomach, confusion swirling inside her. The days had blurred together, but something in her body felt different. She sat on the edge of her bed, her breath shallow, a strange mixture of fear and wonder blooming in her chest. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking through fog. Her hands shook as she whispered the words aloud. No, it can't be. But deep down, she already knew. For days, she tried to deny it. She told herself it was stress, exhaustion, the haunting weight of heartbreak. But as the weeks passed, the whispers in her body grew louder, her strength waned, her heart beat faster at odd moments, and a strange warmth bloomed inside her belly. It wasn't just her anymore. Something was growing. Someone, a piece of him, of Kellen. The man who had destroyed her innocence was now tied to her in the most fragile, sacred way. She sat by the small, cracked mirror, staring at her reflection. Her fingers brushed her lips as tears welled up. How could something so cruel leave behind something so precious? She didn't know whether to cry or smile. The thought of his child inside her made her heart twist painfully. Would he ever care? Would he even believe her? Days turned into a blur of questions, sleepless nights, and trembling hands. Until one morning, she decided she couldn't run from the truth any longer. She had to tell him. She had to face the man who broke her heart, if not for herself, then for the life inside her. When she reached his mansion, the guards looked at her with cold, unfamiliar eyes. She wasn't the maid anymore. She was just another outsider. But her determination burned brighter than their scorn. "Tell him Binta is here," she said firmly, clutching the small shawl around her shoulders. The guards exchanged a glance, hesitating before one finally disappeared inside. Minutes felt like hours before they led her to his office. The same place where she had once seen him make decisions that sealed fates and ended lives. The air smelled of cigar smoke and power. Kalen sat behind his desk, sharp in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. He looked every inch the ruthless man she remembered, except colder, harder. When his eyes lifted to her, there was no trace of the man who had once whispered her name under the storm. "What are you doing here, H?" His voice was calm, too calm. She took a breath, her voice trembling. I need to tell you something." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Make it quick." Her throat tightened. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely breathe. "I'm pregnant, Kalen." The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. His pen stopped mid-motion. Then slowly, his lips curved, not in surprise, not in softness, but in cruel amusement. "Pregnant?" he repeated, as if tasting the word. Then came the laugh, sharp, mocking, cold. "Don't you dare frame me for your mistakes, Binta." Her heart shattered. She took a step closer. "I'm not lying. You know that night." "That night," he cut in sharply, "was nothing. You think because you shared my bed once, you can claim a place in my life?" His voice grew harder, colder. You disgust me. Tears stung her eyes, but she stood firm. I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you. I just thought you should know. Kalen stood, his chair scraping the floor. His presence filled the room like a storm about to break. Get out before I lose my temper, he growled, his eyes burning with something between fury and denial. The guards at the door stiffened. Even they looked uneasy. Binta pressed a trembling hand to her belly, her voice breaking. You'll regret this one day, Kalen. Not because of me, but because of what you're turning away from. His jaw clenched, his face unreadable. For a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt? Pain? It vanished as quickly as it came. He turned away, his back to her. Take her out. The guards didn't have to drag her. She walked out with her head held high, though every step felt like walking on broken glass. The heavy doors shut behind her with a final, echoing thud, like the closing of a coffin. Outside, the wind was fierce, the sky darkening again with another storm. She stumbled into the street, the cold rain washing her tears away. The city blurred around her, the lights, the noise, the life she no longer belonged to. She found herself under a broken streetlight, the same one where she had cried weeks ago after leaving his mansion. Now she sank to her knees again, the rain mingling with her sobs. She pressed her palms to her belly, whispering through trembling lips, I'll protect you, I promise. Even if he doesn't want us, I do. Even if the world turns away, I won't. Lightning flashed above her, illuminating her tear-streaked face. In that moment, she wasn't just a broken maid anymore. She was a mother, a survivor. The first spark of strength began to rise inside her, burning through the ashes of heartbreak. She didn't know where she would go, how she would survive, or what kind of future awaited her. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not let the child of that cruel night suffer for his sins. Days later, she sat in a small clinic, her hands cold as the doctor took her vitals. The sterile room smelled of medicine and old paint. The doctor, an older woman with kind eyes, studied the results quietly. Binta's heart raced as silence stretched. Is everything okay? She asked softly. The doctor looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. Miss Binta, she began carefully, you're not just having a baby. Binta blinked, confusion clouding her mind. What do you mean? The doctor smiled gently, though surprise flickered in her eyes. You're having triplets. For a moment, the world stopped. The words didn't feel real. They floated in the air, heavy and miraculous. Her breath caught, her hands clutching her chest as her eyes filled with tears. Triplets. 3 tiny lives. 3 heartbeats. 3 pieces of him. And of her. She sat in stunned silence, the reality crashing over her like a tidal wave. Fear and awe tangled inside her heart. How would she raise 3 children alone? How would she feed them, protect them, give them a life better than this? Yet even through the fear, a small, fierce smile touched her lips. Maybe this was fate's cruel way of balancing her pain with purpose. Maybe these 3 lives were the light meant to heal what he had broken. She left the clinic with trembling steps, her shawl wrapped tightly around her, her eyes glistening with tears that were no longer only of sorrow, but of strength. That night, as she lay on her bed, the city silent outside her window, she whispered softly to her belly, You'll never know his cruelty. You'll only know my love. Her voice broke, but her resolve didn't. Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance, a warning, a whisper from the world that her story was far from over. Far away, in the dim-lit corridors of his mansion, Kalen poured himself another drink, his hand shaking slightly as an unfamiliar ache gnawed at his chest. He didn't know why, but that night, he couldn't stop hearing her voice. The storm outside howled, and for the first time in years, he couldn't sleep. The doctor's words hung in the air like thunder. Triplets. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. Binta's heart pounded against her ribs, her fingers clutching the edge of the hospital bed as though reality might shatter if she let go. 3 lives, 3 hearts, 3 pieces of the same man who had cast her away like she was nothing. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled her lungs, and tears spilled silently as she pressed a trembling hand to her stomach. Fear curled inside her chest like smoke, not because she was weak, but because she knew the road ahead would be carved in loneliness. That night, as rain beat against the window pane, she sat staring at the ultrasound photo in her hand. 3 tiny shadows, proof of a love she wished had never been. Lightning flashed, and in that brief light she saw her reflection, tired eyes, a brave heart, and a promise taking root. She whispered to the photo, her voice breaking, "You'll have my strength, even if I have to bleed for it." Outside, thunder roared like the heavens themselves had heard her vow. She didn't know that the same storm rolled across Kellen's mansion that night. The same lightning that lit her face flickered against his haunted window. Months crawled like centuries. Binta found work in a dim roadside diner, the kind where tired travelers left their stories behind in half-drunk coffee cups. She wiped tables until her fingers cracked, smiled at strangers to hide her pain, and pressed her palm against her growing belly whenever the world grew cruel. The whispers of her co-workers stung. Poor girl, doesn't even know who the father is. But she never answered. She let the gossip roll off her back like dust, keeping her truth close to her chest like a secret jewel she would never let them steal. The nights were the hardest. In a small rented room above the diner, she would sit by the window, sewing tiny clothes out of old sheets. Every stitch carried a memory of laughter that had never lasted, of warmth that had turned to ash. When the babies kicked, she smiled through tears, whispering names she had chosen: John, Mike, and Paul. Each name a fragment of hope, a prayer whispered to the future. But sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel Kalen's breath on her neck, and she'd jolt awake, terrified that love might still find her. Winter came mercilessly. The roads were slick with ice, and the world felt heavy under a gray sky. Binta's body ached, her hands trembling as she tried to keep working. The diner owner told her to rest, but she couldn't. Every coin mattered. She had to pay rent, buy food, save for the day her babies arrived. That night, walking home, she slipped on the frozen sidewalk. Pain shot through her spine, and she gasped, clutching her belly. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might lose them. But she pushed herself up, staggering through the snow, whispering, "Not tonight, please, not tonight." When she reached her door, she collapsed to her knees, and in that darkness, she swore she heard 3 faint heartbeats, strong and stubborn, fighting just like her. Days blurred into exhaustion. Her back ached, her feet swollen, but she never stopped. The neighbors would sometimes leave small things by her door: a loaf of bread, a blanket, a kind note. She didn't know who, but she thanked them in silent prayers. Her strength became her armor, her loneliness, her teacher. She learned how to hide her tears, how to smile even when her heart screamed. And somewhere across the city, Kellen began waking up at night, his dreams filled with shadows of a woman crying beneath a streetlight. When the time came, it wasn't gentle. Her water broke in the middle of a storm, the same kind of storm that had followed her since that fateful night. The thunder roared as she was rushed into the hospital, her screams echoing through the sterile halls. Hours passed, pain twisting her body until she could barely breathe. But when the first cry broke the silence, she wept, not from pain, but from a love so fierce it could break mountains. Then came the second cry, then the third. 3 voices, 3 souls, 3 promises. The nurses smiled, whispering how beautiful they were. Binta barely heard them. She was lost in the sight of her sons, their tiny fists, their fragile breaths. She reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the shape of their faces. Each one carried something she recognized: the sharp chin, the stubborn frown, and most painfully, the same storm-gray eyes as Kalen. Her heart cracked open again, bleeding love and sorrow in equal measure. For a fleeting second, she imagined him standing there, smiling like a father. But when she blinked, only shadows remained. Days in the hospital turned into a blur of sleepless nights. She learned to feed them, to hold them, to love them more than she thought possible. When the bills came, she worked double shifts again, her body frail but her will unshaken. She sold her jewelry, the same earrings she'd once worn the night Kellen touched her face. Every sacrifice became a seed of hope. Her world now revolved around 3 small heartbeats that gave her reason to keep breathing. At night, when they slept, she'd whisper stories to them, tales of angels, of courage, of love that didn't destroy but healed. "You don't need a father," she murmured once, pressing a kiss to each tiny forehead. "You have me, and I have you." The babies stirred, their soft breaths syncing with hers, as though their souls understood her vow. But as she turned off the lamp, the wind howled outside, carrying the faint echo of a man's name she'd sworn never to speak again, Miles. Away, Kellen sat alone in his mansion, the firelight flickering against his stone-cold face. The house was silent, but his mind wasn't. Every night he saw her in his dreams, her eyes wet, her hands trembling. Sometimes he'd wake up, heart pounding, convinced he heard crying somewhere in the halls. His men noticed his growing distance, his sleeplessness. "You're losing focus," one said. He only stared into the flames, his jaw tightening. "She's gone," he whispered to himself. "And it's better that way." Yet when he closed his eyes again, he saw 3 small shadows reaching toward him. And that night, for the first time in years, the Mafia boss felt something he couldn't control: regret. His nightmare ended with 3 cries echoing in his sleep, faint, distant, yet real enough to make him wake in a cold sweat, not knowing those cries truly existed miles away. 5 years had etched themselves into the city like frost on glass, each winter colder than the last. Yet this morning the snow fell with a gentle persistence, coating streets and rooftops in an immaculate white blanket. Binta walked through the bustling avenues, her coat wrapped tight around her, her boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. She moved with a quiet confidence now, a woman tempered by struggle, by heartbreak, and by the fierce love that had defined her life since that fateful night. Life had carved her into something unbreakable. Her hair, dark and glossy, framed a face that had once trembled at the sight of Keelan, but now shone with a calm strength. The boys, her 3 precious sons, chattered and laughed, their small hands gripping hers as they skipped along the cobblestone streets. Each boy carried the echo of a man who had once turned his back on her, yet in their laughter there was no malice, only innocence, only joy, only the binding thread of family that had grown stronger in the absence of the father they never knew. Their eyes sparkled like polished stones, storm-gray and stubborn, a reflection of the man who had created them, and yet had no idea they existed. Binta looked down at them, her chest swelling with a mixture of pride, protection, and a quiet fear. Today, she would return to the place where it all began, the mansion that had once been the stage of her heartbreak, of the night that had changed everything. Snowflakes landed on her lashes, and she blinked them away, drawing in the crisp air. Her sons squealed as they ran ahead, their small footprints leaving perfect imprints in the snow, leading the way to the grand gates. The ironwork was still as imposing as it had been 5 years ago, black against the whiteness, decorated with frost and the subtle glow of Christmas lights. Binta paused, her hand resting on the gate, the memories flooding back, the cold, the rejection, the emptiness he had left behind. Her breath hitched, but she squared her shoulders, gripping the boy's hands firmly. She would not falter. The gate creaked open under her touch, each note of the sound a haunting chord, echoing the silence she had once fled. Inside, the mansion seemed both familiar and foreign. The grand halls smelled faintly of cedar and dust, a perfume of old power and colder regrets. The fireplace crackled with life, the flames throwing shadows against the walls, shadows that danced like ghosts of her past. And there he sat, Keelan. He had not aged, but something in him had shifted. The arrogance, the cruelty, still lingered in his posture, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes were haunted by mistakes, by choices, by memories he had tried to bury. He was alone, as he always seemed to be, yet the weight of the world pressed visibly upon his shoulders. His glass of whiskey was untouched, shaking slightly in his hand as he stared at nothing, yet everything at once. Then, the door opened. The sound sliced through the mansion like a sudden gust of wind, and in that instant, the world shifted. His heart stopped, not in shock alone, but in recognition. There she was, Binta, radiant, poised, untouchable in her beauty and strength. Her coat fell away to reveal a dress that spoke of elegance and quiet authority, a woman who had survived storms he could not imagine, and with her, 3 boys, laughing, tugging at her hands, each one carrying the unmistakable imprint of him, the same stubborn frown, the same defiant eyes, the same reckless energy he had once believed only he could own. His glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The sound reverberated like a gunshot, and Kellen's world tilted violently on its axis. He had thought himself untouchable, unshakable. He had thought his empire and his power could shield him from everything, even from ghosts of the past. But now they had faces. Faces he recognized in the laughter of 3 innocent children who bore his features, his essence, his legacy. Binta's eyes met his across the room, a storm contained in a glance. They were not pleading, not broken. They were steady, commanding in their own way, and the sight stabbed him with a truth he could not escape. The sons of a night he had abandoned now stood before him, and his mind raced through 5 years of mistakes, regrets, and sleepless nights. One of the boys looked up suddenly, his small voice piercing the heavy air. "Mommy, why does that man look like me?" The question fell like ice, freezing Kellen in place. His throat tightened, his vision blurred with a mix of disbelief, guilt, and something else he could not name. He wanted to speak, to deny, to run, to hide, but the weight of reality pinned him to the floor of his own empire. Binta stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulders, a silent signal of protection and caution. Her lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to mark the triumph of survival over fear. Kellen's knees buckled slightly, the firelight cast eye. Nang a tremble in his shadow. The empire he had built with blood could not shield him from the sight of the 3 lives he had forsaken, the proof of the one night he had tried to forget. The mansion seemed to close in around him, the walls whispering, mocking, reminding him of every choice, every cruelty, every moment he had missed. Snow drifted in through the slightly open window, settling on the floor like tiny accusations. The boys giggled again, tugging at Binta's coat, and for a brief moment the sound broke through the fog of fear and regret that had held Kellen captive. Yet even in their innocence, he felt the sting of betrayal, by himself, by the world, by her. His hands twitched, yearning to reach out, to touch them, to reclaim what he had lost, but the memory of his own cruelty restrained him. He could not move, could not speak, could not yet forgive himself. Binta's gaze softened, just slightly, as if she could read the turmoil in his soul. There was no joy in it yet, only the raw, trembling edges of emotion that had been dormant for years. He was a man who had never faced consequences, yet here they were, embodied in 3 small beings who looked like miniature echoes of him. The room seemed to shrink, the warmth of the fire unable to touch the icy fingers of fear and longing that wrapped around him. Kellen's chest ached. The sound of his heartbeat thundered in his ears louder than the crackling flames, louder than the snow crunching beneath the boy's feet outside. He had been a predator, a ruler of shadows and pain, but now, faced with the innocent reflections of his sins, he was stripped bare. His hands dropped to his sides, shaking. His mind raced through every night of absence, every choice that had left them unprotected, every look he had ever ignored. And in that instant, he realized that power, wealth, even fear could not compare to what he had lost, what he had abandoned. Binta's voice broke through his haze, soft, controlled, yet piercing. "They are safe. They are mine, and I will protect them. From anyone, even you if I have to. Her words were a sword and a shield, the perfect measure of strength and love that had carried her through years of hardship. The boys tugged at her fingers, sensing her command, sensing the invisible walls she had built to protect them. Kellen felt it like a punch to the chest. He wanted to argue, to claim, to apologize, but the weight of time and the truth of her words left him mute. One of the boys took a step forward, curiosity and courage sparkling in his eyes. "Mommy, why does that man look like me?" The words echoed in the grand hall, bouncing off marble and memories alike, and Kellen's knees threatened to buckle beneath him. He had thought himself untouchable, a storm incarnate, but here he was, facing 3 innocent judgments, the living consequences of one night he had tried to erase. His throat burned, his hands shook, and the world felt suddenly too large, too bright, too unforgiving. Binta's gaze did not waver. She had survived betrayal, abandonment, heartbreak, and hardship. Now, she stood before him like a monument to resilience, her sons at her side, and the man who had once ruled everything realized he had lost control over the only things that truly mattered. He wanted to run, to hide, to erase the past, but the truth was undeniable. They were here, alive, thriving, and for the first time in years, he felt something he could not define, something fierce, terrifying, and utterly human: remorse. The boys laughed again, tugging at her coat, unaware of the storm of guilt and desire, love and fear that enveloped the room. Snow fell against the windows, glinting in the firelight like tiny stars, silent witnesses to a reunion that was more accusation than celebration. Kellen swallowed hard, the taste of whiskey and regret still bitter on his tongue, and stepped forward tentatively, unsure if he had permission, unsure if he deserved it, unsure if the world would allow him this glimpse of redemption. Yet Binta's hand on her son's was firm, a silent command that he must proceed cautiously. He took another breath, feeling the weight of 5 years and one night crashing into him. At once, and in that instant, he knew that nothing, not wealth, not fear, not power, could undo the binding truth. The consequences of that night had returned, alive and unyielding, and they demanded reckoning. One of the boys looked up and whispered, "Mommy, why does that man look like me?" The sight of Binta and the boys retreating down the snow-covered streets had lodged itself in Keelan's mind, like a thorn he could not remove. 5 years of absence, of indifference, and yet in that instant he had realized the empire he had built. His power, his money, his fear, was meaningless without the 3 lives he had abandoned. The faces of John, Mike, and Paul haunted him relentlessly, appearing in the shadows of his office, dancing across the walls of his grand mansion, and staring at him in reflections he could not avoid. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw them running in the snow, their laughter piercing the icy walls he had erected around his heart. Meetings became unbearable. Decisions he had once executed with ruthless precision faltered as he pictured Binta's steady eyes and the boys' trusting hands. Deals he had made, alliances forged in blood, now seemed hollow and trivial. His men noticed the change. Keelan's sharp orders lost their edge, his once terrifying presence dulled with hesitation, his gaze frequently drifting toward the windows as if searching for a glimpse of her. Whispers spread among them. "What's wrong with the boss?" They had never seen him like this, so vulnerable, so human, and they feared the worst. The enemies of his empire sensed the shift immediately. Rivals who had trembled at his name now smelled weakness, smelled vulnerability, and began to plot, thinking the mighty Kellen had faltered. But the truth was far simpler, far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. Kellen's heart, long buried beneath layers of cruelty and ambition, remembered what it meant to feel love, to yearn, to ache. He remembered the warmth in Binta's smile, the bravery in her stance, the undeniable bond she shared with the children that were his own flesh and blood. He had tried to ignore it, tried to crush it beneath orders and threats, but the memory of that one Christmas return, her strength, her grace, her unspoken defiance, had shattered his defenses. He could not erase it. He did not want to. One evening, as he drove through the city in silence, his mind fixed on the memory of Binta carrying groceries through the market, her coat wrapped tight, the boys tugging at her hands, he realized he could not remain distant. Without thinking, he stepped from his car and approached her, the cold winter air biting at his face, his heart hammering with fear and longing. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, eyes guarded. "Don't," she said sharply, her voice steady, calm, distant. "You've done enough." Her words cut through him, sharper than any knife, yet he could not retreat. He offered help, his hand brushing against hers, a contact that seemed forbidden, yet essential, a spark that ignited memories he had tried to bury. She stepped back, but the boys giggled, tugging at her coat, unaware of the storm raging between the adults. Kellen's chest tightened, his throat dry, yet he refused to leave. He wanted to apologize, to claim, to do something, anything to mend the irreparable. And in that moment, he realized the extent of his transformation. The ruthless mafia boss who had ruled empires with fear now stood humbled, undone by love he could neither deny nor control. That night, alone in his mansion, he finally allowed himself to feel the tears he had long suppressed. They fell freely, unashamed, a testament to the man he was becoming, the man he had always hidden behind a mask of cruelty. Each drop was a confession, a mourning of the years he had lost, and a silent vow to reclaim the life he had forsaken. The days that followed were no less turbulent. Kalen began to watch from afar, observing the simple moments of Binta's life. Her laughter as the boys chased each other through the snow, her gentle admonishments when they fought, the way she tucked their scarves tight against the cold. Each gesture, each smile, each small victory of motherhood pierced him like a blade of truth. He began to follow her discreetly, ensuring her safety, monitoring threats without her knowledge. Criminal rivals noticed the change in him. Plans went awry, hitmen hesitated, alliances faltered. They whispered in corridors, sensing the uncharacteristic hesitation in a man they once feared without question. And yet, Kellen did not care for their perceptions. His focus had shifted entirely to Binta, to the children, to the family he had abandoned yet could no longer ignore. Every instinct honed by years of survival, every muscle trained to command fear, was now bent toward protection, toward the salvation of those he had wronged. One evening, as dusk painted the city in hues of gray and gold, Binta struggled with her groceries, the boys tugging at her sleeves, impatient and noisy. Kellen, from a distance, recognized the familiar scene of her resilience under pressure, of her quiet strength that had always captivated him. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, intercepting a falling bag before it hit the pavement. The boys looked up, startled by the shadow of the man who had once abandoned them, but Binta's expression remained calm, her eyes steady, unwavering. "Don't," she whispered again, a warning he refused to heed. "You've done enough." He nodded, silent acknowledgement of her boundary, yet he lingered, watching, protecting, unwilling to let harm approach them even for a second. The evening air was thick with unspoken words, shared memories, and the invisible tether that still connected them despite years of distance. And in that simple act, catching a grocery bag, standing between danger and her children, he rediscovered a truth he had long denied. He could no longer be the man he once was. His heart had awakened, vulnerable, fierce, and human. The nights after that encounter were sleepless. Kalen would lie awake in the darkness of his mansion, haunted not by enemies or betrayal, but by visions of Binta and the boys. Their laughter, their cries, their innocence, all haunted him like a specter he could not banish. He felt the weight of his choices pressing upon him, the enormity of his absence, and the terror of what the future might hold if he failed again. His men noticed his distracted demeanor, the tremor in his voice during meetings, the subtle hesitation in his orders. Questions began to circulate among them, whispered cautiously. "Has the boss changed? Is he weak?" Weakness, they did not understand, was not cowardice. It was love. It was remorse. It was the unrelenting ache of a man realizing the world he had built was meaningless without the people who mattered most. And in the shadows, rivals moved closer, unaware that the greatest threat now was not from outside his walls, but from the storm within him, a storm he could not control, yet refused to deny. Kalen's transformation did not go unnoticed by Binta, though she remained guarded. She saw his presence from a distance, subtle acts of care, the quiet protection, the fleeting glances, the sudden interventions when danger approached. She was torn between caution and curiosity, between anger and the faint stirrings of a long-buried hope. She had survived without him for years, yet the sight of him caring, of him risking himself for them, unsettled the carefully constructed walls around her heart. Her resolve was fierce, but the vulnerability of the children and the recognition that he had changed forced her to acknowledge that their fates were entwined once more. And even as she told herself to remain strong, to resist, a of possibility ignited, delicate and terrifying. Could the man who had abandoned them truly return? Could the boy who had cried in her belly be reclaimed by the father who had once rejected him? And then, without warning, danger struck. Shadows moved in the alleys surrounding her home, figures cloaked in threat and malice, seeking revenge against the man who had abandoned them. Binta, alone and unaware, sensed only the faintest hints of danger, the whisper of movement, the sudden hush of the city outside. Her pulse quickened, her instincts screaming, yet she could not see the full scope of what approached. Before she could react, a figure emerged from the darkness. Keelan, he was there, as he had been countless times in his own mind, now flesh and blood, standing between her and the approaching threat. His presence was immediate, commanding, protective, and terrifying. Bullets that might have struck her missed by inches, his body shielding her with reflexes honed over years of survival and combat. The boys clung to her skirts, wide-eyed and terrified, but she felt the crushing weight of relief and fear collide as she realized he had come for them, for her, for all of them. In that instant, the Mafia boss, once feared by enemies and men alike, became their guardian, their savior, the man willing to risk everything for the family he had once rejected. And when danger came knocking at her door, he was there before anyone else. Chaos erupted in the quiet neighborhood before Binta even realized what was happening. The air vibrated with the sound of engines, screeching tires, and the metallic echo of gunfire bouncing off brick walls. Shadows of men clad in black moved with purpose, their faces hidden, their intentions clear. They wanted destruction, a message, a strike against Kellen, and by extension, anything he cared for. Binta froze as the first bullet shattered the streetlights, sparks flying across puddles that reflected the horror in broken fragments. She had raised the boys in a bubble of relative peace, shielding them from the dark world their father had once wrought. You led, but this intrusion ripped the illusion apart, leaving raw fear coursing through her veins. The children clutched her skirts, their small faces pressed to her sides as her heart pounded like a drum of warning. Her mind raced. What could she do? They were outnumbered, unarmed, ordinary in the face of organized violence. She knew her strength alone could not protect them. And then he appeared. Keelan. Emerging from the smoke and shadows like a force of nature, every step deliberate, every movement lethal. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept the scene, analyzing threats, predicting movements, reading the chaos with a precision born of years of fear and power. His presence was magnetic, terrifying, impossible to ignore. Binta's breath caught in her throat as he reached her, each bullet passing by like a whisper of warning, sparks of debris dancing around them. His arm shot out instinctively, sweeping her behind him as another volley tore through the street. Pain seared through his shoulder, crimson blooming against his tailored jacket, yet he didn't falter. His hands, strong and unyielding, guided her and the boys through the debris-strewn alley, pulling them toward a hidden exit she didn't even know existed. "You shouldn't be here!" she screamed, terror and fury mingling in her voice, struggling to push him away, but he pressed closer, holding her face in his hands, eyes burning with a mixture of fear, fury, and something more personal, something that reached beyond protection, into the raw depths of unspoken history. "Neither should you," he whispered, his voice low, urgent, trembling slightly as if revealing a vulnerability he had long denied. Time slowed. The world outside the alley disappeared. For a heartbeat, it was just the two of them, firelight flickering from the distant chaos, casting shadows across their faces. She saw the familiar hardness in his jaw, the reckless set of his shoulders, the intensity in his storm-gray eyes. Keelan, the man she had once feared, loved, and been destroyed by. Memories of the night long ago, whiskey, rain, stolen glances, whispered promises, and bitter cold mornings flooded between them. Her hands, trembling, brushed against his chest, feeling the rapid pulse beneath his shirt, the heat of a man alive with fear for her and the boys. And in that instant, she understood the truth she had tried to bury. He had never truly left her. Not in his mind, not in his heart, not in the dark corners where monsters and men converge. He dragged them to safety into an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the block. Smoke clung to the air, stinging their eyes, but for a fleeting moment, the boys were safe. Kaylin collapsed against the wall, one arm wrapped protectively around Binta, the other pressed against the wound that ran crimson down his sleeve. She looked up at him, fear mingled with confusion and disbelief. Her hands moved instinctively, pressing against the cut, trying to stem the flow of blood, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his skin. He winced, but the look in his eyes was not pain, it was a confession. He had risked everything, bared himself to danger, to fear, to mortality, all for them, and for her. "I never stopped seeing you, Binta," he whispered finally, voice rough, raw, and entirely human. "I just didn't know how to come back." Those words struck her like a blade wrapped in velvet. Hate and longing warred within her chest. She wanted to push him away, to curse the man who had abandoned her and their children. But another part, a quieter part she hadn't allowed herself to hear in years, whispered that he had changed, that the man before her was not the same one who had turned his back on her in a drunken haze of cruelty and pride. Her fingers faltered on his wound, unsure whether to keep tending it or to pull away entirely. Her heart ached with memories and possibilities, a tangle of fear, hope, anger, and desire she couldn't untangle. The noise outside faded gradually as the gang retreated, realizing their attempt to strike had failed. Kellen kept his arms around her, shielding her even from the silence that now hung heavy in the warehouse. He looked down at her, eyes scanning every line of her face, memorizing her, as if he could never bear to let her go again. "I'm here," he murmured, voice barely audible over the distant echoes of gunfire. "And I won't let anything happen to you or the boys. Not now, not ever." The weight of those words pressed against her chest. Could she believe him? Could she forgive him? Could she even allow herself to feel the old pull, the fire she had buried under years of survival and hatred? Her heart thudded painfully as she searched his face for the boy who had once touched her soul, and found him in the man who now fought for her life. The wound in his arm throbbed, painting red across the fabric, yet his eyes softened, vulnerability and desire warring in their depths. The silence between them stretched, thick with unsaid words and old wounds, until he leaned closer, his lips hovering near hers, and she felt the heat of him, the memory of him, the danger of him all at once. The fire of that night, the one that had begun in the shadows of a storm and ended with heartbreak, ignited again, but now fueled by redemption, by protection, by years of longing and regret. And in a breathless instant, he kissed her, rough, desperate, and painfully real. Every second of denial, every year of absence, every night of regret poured into that kiss. Binta's hands trembled against his chest, unsure whether to push him away or pull him closer, the storm outside no match for the one raging between them. The boys peeked from behind crates, wide-eyed, but did not interfere, sensing the intensity, the life-altering force of the moment. Outside, the city hummed obliviously, unaware of the silent battle between past and present, hate and love, loss and reclamation. When they parted, just slightly, both gasping for air, their eyes locked, communicating years of pain, passion, and possibility without a single word. The warehouse was quiet except for their ragged breaths, yet in that silence, something had shifted irreversibly. He had returned, not just as protector, but as the man she had feared and secretly remembered, the man who could destroy her or heal her with a single touch. And as the distant sirens faded and the smoke cleared, she treated his wound in silence, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. His eyes softened once more, vulnerability cracking the hard shell of the Mafia boss to reveal the man beneath, haunted, human, and irrevocably changed. The past had collided with the present, and nothing would ever be the same. He leaned in and kissed her, rough, desperate, and painfully real. Night had fallen like a velvet curtain over the city, wrapping Binta's small home in shadows and the soft hum of distant streetlights. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace flickered against the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with secrets and memories. The boys, John, Mike, and Paul, were nestled under blankets on the living room floor, their small hands clutching stuffed animals, their eyes wide with the curiosity and innocence of childhood. For years, Binta had shielded them from the truth of their father, painting him as a distant figure, a name whispered but never seen. Yet now, after everything that had transpired, the storms, the battles, the kisses, and the promises, they could no longer contain their questions. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a quiet energy that pressed on Binta's chest, warning her that the walls she had built were about to tremble. It was John, the eldest, who finally spoke. His voice was tentative, almost afraid to shatter the fragile peace of the room. "Mommy, are you sure that man? Is he really our dad?" The question hung in the air like a stone thrown into a still lake, sending ripples across hearts and memories alike. Binta froze, her hands tightening on the blanket she held, as if gripping it could hold back the torrent of truth she had long concealed. The boy's eyes searched hers, wide and trusting, demanding honesty she had been so careful to ration. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel Keelan behind her, silent, hesitant, waiting for her to give him permission to step into a life he had once abandoned. Keelan's chest rose and fell unevenly. The man who had once been a monster of power and fear now knelt before her children, the weight of years, guilt, and longing pressed into every movement. He swallowed hard, the words stuck in his throat, as if the fear of rejection might choke him entirely. His eyes, stormy and filled with regret, softened as he looked at the small faces illuminated by the gentle firelight. He wanted to say so many things, apologize, explain, promise, but all he managed was a voice trembling under the weight of truth. "Yes, I'm your father, and I'm sorry I wasn't there." The room was silent for a heartbeat, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the shallow breaths of 3 children who were meeting a truth long denied. Binta's eyes filled with 2 ears, hot and unrelenting, as she watched her sons absorb the revelation with a mixture of awe and instinctive love. They did not recoil, nor did they step back. Instead, slowly, they approached him. First John, then Mike, and finally Paul, each wrapping their small arms around him, hugging him as though they had known him all their lives. The warmth of their embrace struck Kellen with a force stronger than any bullet he had ever faced. The hollow, ruthless chambers of his heart began to fill with something long forgotten and achingly human. Love, tender and unguarded. Binta felt the walls around her heart begin to crumble. For years, she had carried the weight of anger, betrayal, and fear. She had built invisible barriers to protect her children and herself from the man who had once shattered their lives. But now, seeing the innocence in their trust, the raw vulnerability of Kellen kneeling before them, her defenses faltered. Every rational thought collided with her longing, her heart whispering truths she had denied. Perhaps he had changed. Perhaps he could be trusted. Perhaps the man who had destroyed their past could rebuild a future with them. Later that night, after the boys had been tucked into bed and the house was hushed save for the occasional creak of settling wood, Kellen and Binta stood on the balcony, the moonlight washing the city in silver. The chill of the night bit at their skin, but neither noticed. Kellen's hands were raw from the fights and struggles he had endured just to protect them that day, but he reached for Binta, wrapping her fingers around his own, anchoring them both in the present. His voice was low, hoarse with emotion and unsaid apologies, carrying the weight of years lost and time stolen. "Give me a chance to love you right this time." Binta looked at him, really looked at him. Not as the Mafia boss whose empire of fear had ruled the city, not as the man who had abandoned her, but as the human being who had lost himself, and in losing himself, had finally returned. Her lips trembled, the mixture of fear, hope, and lingering resentment, and battling for dominance in her heart. Could she trust him again? Could she allow the man who had once destroyed everything to now rebuild it alongside her? The night was heavy with anticipation, the soft hum of the city below echoing their silent deliberation. She saw the flicker of desperation and longing in his eyes, the rawness of a man stripped of pretense, and it both terrified and tempted her. Her heart beat erratically, the echoes of past pain warning her, the whispers of love tempting her. Finally, she parted her lips, voice barely a whisper, edged with steel. "If you break us again, I'll destroy you." The words were a boundary, a line drawn with courage, love, and fear entwined. It was a promise and a warning all at once, an assertion of her power, not over him, but over the life and love of her children. Keelan's chest heaved. He nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of her declaration. He understood that this was more than words. It was a test of his sincerity, a challenge to the man who had survived empires, assassinations, and betrayal, yet now faced the simplest, most human of trials: redemption, trust, and love. The air between them crackled, electric and heavy with unspoken promises and cautious hope. Her lips parted. "If you break us again, I'll destroy you." Snow fell silently over the city, each flake a whisper of the past, a frozen memory settling on the streets below. The grand mansion, once a fortress of power and fear, now glowed with warmth and light, every window a promise of renewal, every wreath hung with care, a symbol of life reclaimed. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation and quiet joy. The boys, John, Mike, and Paul, dashed across the polished floors, laughter bouncing off the walls like music, carrying with it a freedom that had once been denied. Their cheeks were rosy from the chill outside, their small hands dusted with snowflake, aches that had clung to their winter coats, and their eyes shone with the unfiltered delight of children who had never truly known fear when love was near. Binta moved among them, graceful and composed, yet her heart fluttered with every small motion, every giggle, every shared glance between her children and the man she had once feared and loved in equal measure. 5 years had tempered her pain, had hardened her resolve, but it had also polished her into a woman whose strength was matched only by her beauty, her poise, her unwavering dedication to the family she had created against all odds. Her eyes followed the boys as they decorated the Christmas tree with ornaments that glittered like stars, their small hands reaching high, laughter spilling from their lips like warm sunlight. Each moment was a victory over the shadows of the past, each smile a testament to survival and love that had endured the cruelties of time. Callan stood by the fire, watching quietly at first. The man who had once ruled through fear and intimidation now marveled at the scene before him. The room filled with warmth, love, and light, a life he had never believed he deserved, a life Binta had fought to protect without him. Every ornament on the tree, every twinkle in the boy's eyes, was a reminder of what he had lost, what he had abandoned, and what he had now been given back. The sight stirred something deep inside him, something raw and human. The armor of the Mafia boss had cracked long ago, but now it was shedding entirely, revealing the man who had been hidden beneath the empire of shadows, the man who could love, who could feel, who could hope again. Binta caught his gaze across the room, the firelight dancing in his storm-gray eyes. There was no threat there now, no cold calculation, only a reverent humility, a gratitude that could not be spoken aloud. She felt her breath hitch as he began to move toward her, the soft click of polished shoes on marble announcing his approach. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, weighted with the years of remorse and longing that he so aeried silently in his chest. When he reached her, he took her hand gently, placing it over his heart, as if to convey what words could not. "I was a monster once," he whispered, his voice low and sincere. "But you gave me a reason to be human again." The words resonated through her, cutting through years of pain, sealing forgiveness and hope in a single, fragile instant. The boys ran past them, unaware of the quiet exchange, their laughter ringing in the air like silver bells. Kellen turned briefly, ruffling John's hair and smiling, then reached for Binta again, pulling her close. The scent of pine and snow mixed with the faint, lingering aroma of his cologne, memories of past nights brushing against the present. His lips found hers, the kiss slow, deliberate, carrying every year of longing, every night of regret, every breath of fear and desire they had endured apart. It was not a kiss of passion alone. It was a kiss of redemption, of reclamation, of a future finally begun. She melted into him, her hands pressed to his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart that had learned to love truly, fiercely, without reservation. The music in the background faded into a soft silence, allowing the crackle of the fire and the muted snow against the windows to fill the room. Outside, the world remained cold and indifferent, but inside, warmth and life flourished. The Christmas lights twinkled, reflecting in Binta's tear-filled eyes, painting her face with gold and red, green and white, the colors of hope, survival, and rebirth. For a long moment, time seemed suspended. Nothing existed beyond the four walls of that room, no past mistakes, no cruel memories, no empire of fear. There was only the love between a woman and a man who had once destroyed everything, and the children who carried pieces of both, binding their souls together forever. Kalen pulled back slightly, rested, nung his forehead against hers, breathing in her scent, memorizing every line, every detail of the woman who had survived the impossible and still loved him despite everything. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," he murmured, voice trembling with the weight of honesty. "But I can promise I will never leave you or them, never again." Binta pressed her hand to his cheek, letting her thumb brush away a stray tear, feeling the raw sincerity that emanated from every pore of his being. She nodded, a single, slow movement, the quiet acceptance of a heart that had fought so long to forgive, to trust, to love again. The boys, sensing the change in the room, paused in their decorating and ran to stand beside their parents. John reached up and placed a small hand on Kellen's arm, Mike on Binta's, and Paul stood close, his eyes wide with wonder. The family, broken, scarred, yet unshakably bound, stood together under the glow of the Christmas lights, the fire crackling in harmony with their beating hearts. There was laughter, soft and unrestrained, and a sense of peace that none of them had known before. The ghosts of the past seemed to melt away with the falling snow, leaving only warmth, only home, only love that was fierce, enduring, and eternal. Binta's eyes met Kellen's once more. No words were needed. Every apology, every regret, every lost year was acknowledged and forgiven in the unspoken exchange of their gaze. The empire of fear, the life of cruelty, the darkness that had once defined him, none of it mattered anymore. In its place was a life he had never dared imagine, a life built not on fear, but on love, trust, and redemption. He had finally come home, not to the mansion, but to the hearts that mattered most.